Welcome to the Chapter 2, Part 1 edition of Torrey's Top 10. Number 10. Moral theories may seem very obtuse and abstract, but actually we rely on theory and principles a lot more than we realize. In the same way that we rely on the principle of causality for making empirical judgments, we rely on a number of different moral principles and moral theories to make judgments about what is right and wrong or good and bad. In science, theories help us understand the empirical world. For example, we take causality for granted. When something happens, we believe there's a cause for it. If suddenly all of the lights go out, we think, something caused that. There's a down power line, or we broke a breaker. Similarly, in ethics, we rely on theories and principles not to give us causal accounts about the world, but to give us accounts that explain or justify why an action is right or wrong, or why some character trait is good or bad. And by making use of moral theories, we are able to better understand the world around us in a moral sense and make moral judgments through reasoned arguments. When we give a moral argument, our arguments contain not merely empirical facts, but they contain premises or reasons that are made up of both empirical facts as well as appealing to moral theories and principles. We don't judge that something is right or wrong simply by saying such and such is the case in the world. We don't say it's wrong to lie because Jane lied. We say it's wrong to lie because you can harm someone when you lie, or because you undermine someone's autonomy when you lie. So we use moral theories and moral principles to make moral arguments in combination with empirical facts about the world. Moral principles, things like it's wrong to kill or you should never lie, are typically furnished by and supported by moral theories, which are much larger in scope. But remember that moral theories don't drive moral judgments on their own. Moral judgments require both empirical facts as well as moral principles and moral theories. Number 9. What are theories of obligation? Theories of obligation are moral theories that are concerned with right action, whether the actions that we do are right or wrong, whether or not we're choosing the right action in a given scenario. What action are we obligated morally to perform? Examples of theories of obligation are divine command theory, utilitarianism, Kantianism, and care ethics. Number 8. What are virtue-based theories? Virtue-based theories, unlike theories of obligation, are concerned with the character of persons rather than the rightness or wrongness of our actions. The primary virtue-based theory is, unsurprisingly, virtue ethics. Number 7. What is utilitarianism? Utilitarianism is a moral theory based on the greatest happiness principle. Choose the action that brings about the greatest happiness and the least amount of pain for all those involved. There are two distinct forms of utilitarianism, act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. You should have a basic idea of the distinction between these two approaches. Act utilitarianism requires that you use the greatest happiness principle to make a choice about what action you should perform, what obligation you have to perform a certain action, by appealing to the greatest happiness principle for each particular action. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, requires you to use the greatest happiness principle to ask, if we were to follow rules over time, which action as a rule would bring about the greatest good for the greatest number involved as a whole over the course of time. So rule utilitarianism means that each particular action need not be weighed according to the greatest happiness principle. Only the rules that we follow should be weighed against the greatest happiness principle. Whereas for act utilitarianism, each individual act should be weighed against the greatest happiness principle. Number 6. What is Kantian deontology? Kantian deontology is another obligation theory like utilitarianism. However, unlike utilitarianism, Kantian ethics is not concerned with the consequences of an action. Utilitarianism is all about the consequences. Bring about the best consequences for the people involved. Kantian ethics disregards consequences altogether. Consequences have nothing to do with the rightness or wrongness of an action. Kantian ethics is based on the universal moral law, which is known as the categorical imperative. There are 4 different formulations to the categorical imperative. The primary formulation being the universality formulation. What is a categorical imperative? Well, a hypothetical imperative, you've probably heard the term hypothetical, is an imperative, a demand, only hypothetically. That is, for example, if you want to get an A in the class, then you should read carefully and study for the course. A hypothetical imperative is, if you want to make a lot of money, then you should choose a lucrative career. If you want to lose weight, then you should eat right. A categorical imperative, on the other hand, is an imperative or demand that is not hypothetical. It's not if you want something, then you should do it. It's categorical. You should do it. There is no if-then. So the categorical imperative is a categorical universal moral law that tells you, do this. The universal formulation of the categorical imperative states that you should act only on those maxims which you can at the same time will that they should become a universal moral law. We'll talk more about the categorical imperative, but for now, you should understand that what it does is provides us with a moral law or moral principle that should be followed absolutely and objectively, helping us to make sure that we're not making judgments based on our own biases or emotions. Because we should only choose the action that we can will, without contradiction, that everyone else would choose, and that we could will to become universal law that everyone would follow. Number 5, what is virtue ethics? Your textbook is a little sparse on virtue ethics. The author is clearly not an ancient philosopher, is not a virtue ethicist, but we already know that virtue ethics is a form of virtue theory as opposed to obligations theory. So virtue ethics is concerned primarily with a person's character rather than primarily with the actions that a person chooses to do. For Aristotle, developing good character over time is what it takes to be moral. For Aristotle, we use reason as human beings to discern what is required of us to develop good moral character. And we only become virtuous by developing habits of good character over the course of our lives. By developing good moral character, we can flourish or achieve eudaimonia, the Greek word for happiness, although Aristotle means happiness in a much different sense than the utilitarians mean happiness. Aristotle's not concerned with happiness in the form of pleasure, but rather happiness as a form of human good, living the good life. To be happy is to have lived a good moral life, for Aristotle. Number 4, what is the ethics of care? The ethics of care is concerned with the relationships among people. Unlike most other moral theories, the ethics of care rejects the idea of a kind of abstract, overgeneralized, universal morality in favor of a morality that considers moral emotions like compassion and empathy, and considers the judgments and choices that we make as people who are embedded in relationships with others. You'll find that this is a really important moral theory, particularly in bioethics, since these questions are questions about caretaking, about decisions that are made by people who are parts of families and parts of relationships that influence the kinds of moral judgments that we make. Most care ethicists cast great criticisms against the other moral theories because they're too impartial. They don't consider the relationships that we have with others and how those relationships influence our moral decisions. Number 3, what is natural law theory? Natural law theory is a moral and social theory which holds quite simply that the right action is the action that human beings tend to reason is right. This is a teleological theory, meaning that it has a kind of end in sight, that we're on a linear path working towards some end goal as humans. So natural law theory holds that there is some natural way that human beings are. There is some sort of predetermined or true nature about our actions and our goals. And so by following this true nature and reasoning as human beings are naturally disposed to reason, we already know what is right and what is wrong. Natural law theory doesn't really give us a way to deal with moral dilemmas because it doesn't really offer us a hard and fast rule or principle with respect to reasoning about morality. It simply suggests that we should reason as we do and we'll know what's right. But it should be fairly easy to see, and if it isn't right now, it will be by the time we get into the thick of this course, that what we think is right often conflicts with something else that we think is right, or what we think is wrong might conflict with something else that we think is wrong. And it's not clear what the right answer is to what is good or what is right. It does offer us the doctrine of double effect, and you should know what that is. But natural law theory doesn't go a long way in giving us a lot to work with in terms of helping us form good moral arguments. Number 2, what is contractarianism? Much like natural law theory, contractarianism is also a really popular theory in social and political philosophy, as well as moral philosophy. Generally, contractarianism relies on the idea of a social contract. That is, that through reason, people can agree on the rules and laws that a society should follow. And so we can come to figure out what's moral by thinking and reasoning about the kinds of rules and laws and principles that most rational people would agree with. And the number 1 thing you should know about Chapter 2, Part 1 is, how do we evaluate moral theories? In the same way that we have ways of evaluating if scientific theories are good ones, for example, the scientific method states that an experiment has to be repeatable and so on and so forth, we also have criteria to judge whether a moral theory is adequate or a good theory and how it stands up to other theories. One criterion for moral theories is whether or not the moral theory is consistent with what we already consider to be our moral judgments. Does the moral theory guide us to make judgments that are more or less in line with the kinds of judgments we typically think to be acceptable. So if a moral theory concluded that it's perfectly fine to murder innocent people, we might question that theory because it doesn't seem to be aligned with our considered moral judgments. Another criteria for judging moral theories is whether or not that moral theory is aligned with the facts of our moral lives. That is, if the theory is so ideal that it doesn't apply to the way that we live our lives morally, it may not be a very good moral theory. It may not be helpful to us in making moral judgments. So the moral theory should be aligned with our experiences of moral life. And finally, another criteria for judging moral theories is how good a resource it is for helping us to solve moral problems. So even if a moral theory is aligned with the way that we live our moral lives, if it doesn't actually help us to come to answers or make judgments about actions and character, then it's no good to us as a moral theory. A moral theory should help us to resolve conflict and make judgments and choices in our moral lives. And that's a wrap. Theories of obligation. Oh, come on, bird. No. As well as moral principles. As well as hello?
Bogak?